In 1815, Nathan Rothschild stood on the floor of the London Stock Exchange and did nothing. He had just received news that no one else in England had. News that would move markets by 20% in a single day. News that kings were waiting for. He did nothing for hours. Then he sold, slowly, quietly, until the traders around him panicked and sold everything they had. Then he bought it all back at the bottom. What happened that day was not illegal. There were no laws against it. But it was the smallest of the Rothschild secrets. The larger ones involved financing both sides of war simultaneously, bribing government officials across 5 countries, using their courier network to intercept information that was never meant for them, and building a system so embedded in European finance that when governments tried to investigate them, they discovered that the investigators themselves were on the Rothschild payroll. This is the story they never wanted told. To understand the Rothschild secrets, you first have to understand the Rothschild system. Meyer Amschel Rothschild built his banking network on a principle that was simple to state and almost impossible to execute. Information is money. Whoever knows first wins. He established a courier network that operated independently of every public postal system in Europe. Rothschild riders traveled by dedicated routes, crossed borders through channels that customs officials had been paid to leave unmonitored, and carried dispatches that were written in a family code that no outside party could read. This network was not simply faster than its competitors. It was fundamentally different in kind. Public postal systems served everyone who could pay for them. The Rothschild network served only the Rothschilds. Its entire purpose was to create and maintain an information advantage so complete that no competitor could close the gap. By the time Nathan Rothschild was operating in London in the 1810s, the family's information network spanned 5 countries and employed hundreds of agents, riders, and informants. Some of these agents worked openly as Rothschild employees. Others were embedded in positions, government offices, rival banking houses, shipping companies, military headquarters, that made their connection to the Rothschilds impossible to prove and in some cases impossible to detect. The network did not simply carry financial information, it carried everything: troop movements, diplomatic dispatches, the private communications of ministers and kings. Information that the people who generated it would have been horrified to know was being read in a Frankfurt banking house within days of it being written. How much of this information was obtained through interception rather than legitimate intelligence gathering is impossible to determine with precision. What is documented is that the Rothschilds consistently knew things they should not have known, knew them faster than any legitimate explanation could account for, and used that knowledge to make financial decisions that generated returns no other institution in Europe could match. The financing of wars on both sides is the Rothschild secret that historians have documented most thoroughly, and that the family's defenders have worked hardest to explain away. The basic fact is not disputed. During the Napoleonic Wars, the Rothschild family provided financial services to multiple parties simultaneously. Nathan in London was financing the British war effort. Other family members maintained relationships with French financial interests. The family's courier network operated across lines that armies were dying to hold. The family's defenders argue that this was simply good business in a complex environment. European finance was interconnected. The same banks that lent to governments also maintained relationships with merchants, other governments, and financial institutions across borders that war did not fully sever. To have refused to deal with any party connected to the enemy would have been commercial suicide. This argument is not without merit, but it understates what was actually happening. The Rothschilds did not merely maintain passive financial relationships across conflict lines. They actively used their position as financiers to multiple parties to gather intelligence that they then deployed for their own financial benefit. When they knew that one side was running low on funds, they could predict military outcomes that pure military analysis would not have suggested. When they knew that a government was about to request emergency financing, they could position themselves to provide it on terms that only a lender with no competition could extract. They were not simply banking. They were using the access that banking provided to gather intelligence that transcended banking. And they were doing this on all sides simultaneously, which meant that regardless of which side won any particular engagement, the Rothschilds had information and relationships that would allow them to profit from the outcome. Napoleon understood this. He was, among other things, a man who understood finance and its relationship to military power. He described the Rothschilds as a power more formidable than any army, specifically because they operated across borders that armies could not cross. He was trying to shut them down when he was defeated. After Waterloo, the Rothschilds continued to finance multiple sides in multiple conflicts: the Crimean War, the various independence movements of the 1840s, the American Civil War, where the family maintained financial relationships with interests on both sides, even as they declined to make the large-scale commitments that would have clearly identified them with either party. The pattern was consistent. The Rothschilds financed conflict without financing any particular outcome, which allowed them to profit from the conflict itself, regardless of how it ended. The bribery is documented in ways that the family has never been able to fully explain. European governments in the 19th century were not well equipped to resist systematic corruption. Civil servants were poorly paid. Regulations were minimal. The concept of a conflict of interest as an institutional problem, rather than simply a personal moral failing, was not yet well developed. The Rothschilds operated in this environment with systematic efficiency. Government officials who provided the family with advance notice of policy decisions, bond issuances, or regulatory changes received payments that were structured to look like legitimate consulting fees or investment returns on small financial positions that the Rothschilds managed for them. The payments were real, the services rendered were real. The arrangement was designed so that no individual transaction could be easily characterized as a bribe, even though the cumulative effect was to put government officials in a position of financial dependency on the family they were supposed to be regulating. The most extensively documented case involves the British government's bond market. Throughout the early 19th century, the Rothschild family received advance notice of British government bond issuances that allowed them to position themselves ahead of the market. The information came from sources within the treasury that were, in several documented cases, receiving payments from Rothschild-connected accounts. When parliamentary investigators began examining these relationships in the 1840s, they discovered that several of the most important witnesses were themselves recipients of Rothschild financial favors. The investigation produced a report that was notably vague in its conclusions, given the specificity of the evidence that had been gathered. The investigators had encountered a problem that would become familiar to anyone who tried to hold the Rothschilds accountable. The family's financial relationships were so extensive that finding a genuinely independent investigator was nearly impossible. Everyone with the expertise and access to conduct a meaningful investigation had some connection to Rothschild money. The anti-Semitic conspiracy theories about the Rothschilds are among the most persistent and destructive lies in modern history. The family has been accused over 2 centuries of controlling global governments, engineering wars for profit, running secret societies, and conspiring to dominate the world through hidden financial manipulation. These accusations have been used to justify persecution, violence, and ultimately genocide. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a fabricated anti-Semitic text that circulated widely in the early 20th century, drew heavily on distorted versions of Rothschild history to construct a fantasy of Jewish world domination. None of these conspiracy theories are true. The Rothschilds did not control governments. They influenced specific government officials through financial relationships, which is different in kind from control. They did not engineer wars for profit in any simple sense. They profited from wars because they were the primary financiers of governments that fought wars, which is different from causing the wars. They did not run secret societies. They had a private courier network and a family code for financial communications, which served commercial purposes. The documented secrets of the Rothschilds are serious enough. Without embellishment, the insider trading, the systematic corruption of government officials, the financing of multiple sides in conflicts to profit from the conflict itself, the use of a private intelligence network that gathered information through means that ranged from legitimate to deeply questionable. These things happened. They are documented, they deserve examination, but they happened within a context. The Rothschilds operated in a world where the rules of finance were being written in real time, where the concept of insider trading did not yet legally exist, where the corruption of government officials was a standard tool of a business for any institution with sufficient resources, and where the gathering of intelligence through any available means was simply what powerful actors did. They were not uniquely criminal. They were uniquely effective at practices that were common to their era. The anti-Semitic versions of their story transformed these documented practices into a fantasy of superhuman malevolence and racial conspiracy. The effect was to make the actual documented history harder to examine clearly, because any serious examination of Rothschild practices risked being associated with the lunatic fringe that had turned those practices into the foundation of a genocidal ideology. The Rothschilds benefited from this confusion in a way that was almost certainly unintentional. The more extreme the conspiracy theories became, the easier it was to dismiss all criticism of the family's practices as anti-Semitism. The genuine secrets became harder to examine clearly because they were buried under layers of fabrication. The Rothschild archive in London is one of the most carefully managed repositories of family documentation in the world. Researchers who have worked with it describe a professionally staffed institution that is genuinely helpful with certain categories of material, and notably careful about others. Documents that shed light on the family's philanthropic work and public activities are well catalogued and relatively accessible. Documents that might illuminate the family's intelligence gathering methods, its relationships with government officials, or its practices during the Napoleonic Wars are, in many cases, either not available to researchers or available only in forms that have been reviewed and in some cases redacted before release. This is not unique to the Rothschilds. Powerful families manage their archives. They fund their own historians. They shape their own narratives. What is notable is the consistency with which the Rothschild archives' restricted materials correspond to exactly the periods and topics that would be most relevant to understanding the family's less publicly celebrated practices. The courier network records from the Napoleonic period the correspondence with government officials during the parliamentary investigations of the 1840s, the internal family communications during the Civil War period, when the family was maintaining relationships on both sides of the American conflict. The gaps are not random, they are specific, and their specificity tells its own story. Nathan Rothschild died in 1836. He was 58 years old and had spent 30 years building the most powerful private financial institution in the world. His last years were spent partly managing his business empire and partly managing something else. His reputation, the stories about Waterloo, had begun circulating in forms he did not like. The parliamentary investigators were beginning to ask questions about the family's relationships with government officials. The press was starting to take an interest in the Rothschild courier network and how it worked. Nathan understood with the same clarity he had brought to the bond market that the management of information about the Rothschilds was as important as the management of information by the Rothschilds. He had his lawyers, he had his relationships with editors and publishers. He had the simple deterrent effect of being the most powerful banker in England, which meant that most publications were reluctant to pursue stories that might damage their relationship with a family, that could affect their access to capital. He did not live to see the full flowering of the Rothschild reputation management apparatus. That would be his successor's project, but he understood the need for it, and he laid the groundwork. The irony is complete. A family that built its fortune on superior access to information spent the next 2 centuries, ensuring that certain information about them would remain inaccessible. The system that built the empire became the system that protected the empire's image, and that system, unlike the courier network that preceded it, has never been broken. The Rothschilds are still here, still operating, still managing with considerable sophistication the story that the world tells about them. The documented secrets are available to anyone willing to look past the conspiracy theories on one side and the official family histories on the other. The insider trading at Waterloo, the systematic corruption of government officials, the dual financing of conflicts, the intelligence network that gathered information through means that ranged from legitimate to deeply questionable. These things happened. They were the foundations on which the most powerful banking dynasty in history was built. And the most remarkable secret of all is not any specific act or transaction. It is that a family operating at this scale with these practices in this period managed to shape its public reputation so completely that 2 centuries later, most people who know the Rothschild name associate it primarily with philanthropy, culture, and the occasional conspiracy theory that the family can easily dismiss. The real story is hiding in plain sight. It always was. Subscribe if this one changed how you see the dynasty. Every week we go deeper into the families that shaped history and the secrets they kept while doing it. The truth is always more complicated than the official version. It always is.